Welcome back to Introduction to Talmudic Legal Logic. In this lecture, we'll be discussing the Talmudic cast of characters. As you've probably already seen and are yet to see, the Talmud is full of rabbis, and they're always citing each other and arguing with each other and trying to figure out what each other says. To try to understand who these people were, we're going to look a little bit at a historical background of what the layers of sages were like. It's useful to start off by talking a little bit about the historical background that situates these people in the time and place in which they operated. The background has to do with the destruction of the Second Temple and the Roman exile in 70 CE. During the times of the Temple, the way worship happened among the Israelites and the Judahites had to do with a priestly sacrifice-based culture. There was a temple, people brought animals, people brought offerings, the animals were being sacrificed. A lot of the Bible is devoted to the rules of how this is done, and we know that it was extensively done during the Second Temple as well. But when the temple was destroyed and the critical mass of people were exiled out of the country, were banished to exile to various cultures, including to Babylonia, they had to adapt to the fact that the religious and cultural center and the main way in which they worshipped was gone. It had been demolished. It's also important to say that even though the exile was prompted, of course, by an outside force, by the Roman Empire, it also happened against the backdrop of considerable internal conflict and strife. There's a saying in the Talmud that the Second Temple collapsed because of gratuitous hatred, sinat chinam, and not just because of the Romans. So some of the factions that were fighting during the last days of the Second Temple involved Kanaim against Metunim, folks who were more extremist against the Romans, and folks who thought that you could reason with the Romans and try to eke out an existence under the Roman Empire. Pharisees versus Sadducees, so folks that were more devoted to priestly rituals versus folks who were holding the government, and possibly sects that had removed themselves from the centers of power, such as the folks who were in the Qumran caves. They used to be referred to, and this is sometimes righteously, sometimes erroneously, as the Essenes, but there might not be a complete identification between these people and the folks who retreated to the Qumran caves. So, in the aftermath of the temple, a small elite that's trying to get its bearings under the huge disaster that has happened to the people is perhaps not quite aware of what kind of impact it's going to have. For now, all they are doing is studying in small groups, and they're trying to assert their authority through something new, something that is going to supplant the sacrifice-based cult that existed prior to the temple's destruction. During the period in which the temple still existed, and even after the temple was demolished, there were still groups that were studying on what is now recognized as modern Israel. There is, in fact, a story from the later days, shortly before the temple, a Talmudic story that involves Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the wise people who were in Jerusalem before the collapse, reaching out to the emperor and asking for permission to get some students out of the city and move them to the city of Yavne, where they can continue studying. He actually negotiates with the emperor. If the stories about this body of students or this religious court are true, then this is a court that might have operated in various towns and cities across the Galilee, or what is now the Galilee, including Usha, including Bet Shearim, including Tzipori, and various other locations in the north of the country. So they continue to operate even after the temple collapses, producing intellectual text-based discussions that become encapsulated in the text that we now know as the Mishnah. The Mishnah is redacted, this is assumed, around 200 CE, and is usually attributed to the last president of the Sanhedrin, known as Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. A little bit about them. When there is an attribution in Talmudic text to somebody who is a Tana, somebody who is one of the rabbis of this period up to 200 CE in the Galilee, this lends some legitimacy to what is going on, especially if the person who's being mentioned is beloved and respected. Did these people actually exist? So there are some biographies or some people who have tried to look at these rabbis as if they were real people. But we have very little to no material evidence that confirms that these people were actual historical characters. And what they say and what they do is sometimes inconsistent across the text. So while the mention of a particular Tanna might be associated with a particular interpretive approach, that is not necessarily the case with respect to other Tanaim who might say one thing in the context of one debate and another in the context of another. Maybe these people are not real people. Maybe they're just legends floating in the ether, and the people who are writing the Talmud are randomly attributing things to these Tanaim to lend more legitimacy to what is going on. And it's also possible that if these rabbis did not exist, certain interpretive methods are being attributed to them because there's some assumption that this particular figurehead represents a particular interpretive tendency. We're going to talk more about this as we continue with our course. There is also the possibility, and this happens quite frequently in the Talmud, of anonymous attributions. Sometimes the text will refer to somebody called the Tana Kama, or the first Tana. This is usually when they're quoting the Mishnah to address a particular rule statement. They're going to start off and say, the rule was X, we don't know who said it, but one of the Tanaim, the first person to enter the debate, said this. Sometimes they're also going to do an anonymous attribution by doing exactly the sort of thing that we were all told in English composition not to do, which is use passive voice. Matnitin. The Mishnah says, right? And we're not attributing it to any particular person. We're also going to find the words tanu or tanan or tanya oftentimes, and this would quote a source that is considered to be part of the Tanaitic period, even though it is not part of the codexes that we actually have, the Mishnah and the Tosefta. So oftentimes this will be quoting a Baraita meaning external, right? This is an external text that might or might not have survived. We might or might not have it encapsulated in the Mishnah or in the Tosefta. Sometimes this is a real Baraita, and sometimes they just make one up when they want to add some legitimacy, garner some legitimacy for a particular position. So, who are the people who are doing the interpretation? Who are these people who are making up the Tanaim or attributing things to the Tanaim? That's where we go to the next step, and those are the Amoraim. So we've seen that a Talmud page will have the Mishnah, which is a Tanaitic era source, and then there will be the Gemara interpreting the Mishnah by Gemara era rabbis. It said that the Amoraim were active both in Roman Palestine and in Babylonia between 200 CE, sort of the time in which the Mishnah is redacted, and deep into the 5th century, maybe some people even say past the 6th century. These are the Amoraim, these are the later era sages. Typically, what you would find, especially in Babylonia, will be pretty organized. They will come in couples, they would work together, and you will find these famous couples who often have debates or co lead a particular school of thought. When these people are named, it's usually to lend authority or to illustrate a particular character's perspective. Whether these Amoraim existed or not, again, the biographical details might be real or there might be fake, but they are illustrative. So, for example, sometimes there will be a story about a particular Amorah who was traveling from Israel to Babylonia and what happened to them on the road. This might or might not reflect something that actually happens. Sometimes there's also an anonymous voice in the Gemara, right? It's just like there's a statement being made, but it's not attributed to anybody. Sometimes this is offered as commentary on the named characters. Finally, we have the Savoraim, who are kind of like the tail end of the Gemara era. It's possible that the people who operated during this time were the people who ended up redacting the Talmud in the version that we're studying from today. Although some recent approaches say that we can push back the date at which the Talmud was redacted well into the 7th or even past the 7th century. The story with the Savoraim as redactors is that their voice is often anonymous. Whenever you're seeing some kind of a conclusion that appears to be the editor kind of closing a topic, one of the recommendations that Talmud scholars make is to read against the grain. The take that these Savoraim might have on the takes that appear under people's names are not always the last word of the subject, and sometimes you might find some cause for debate there. Among the participants in the conversation, you're going to find people who are not just the rabbis. So sometimes some of the characters, it's a world of men, the Talmud usually, but sometimes you will see some female characters appear. Somebody's wife will appear, or somebody's mom or sister will make conversation. Somebody's daughter will come in with a dish of food and have something to say. Some woman would come before the court, and whenever that happens, you should try to read the text against the grain. There is some work on feminist commentary of the Talmud that suggests that the fact that so few women appear in the text can also be proof of the fact that traditions that lent power and authority to women were aggressively silenced. And if we're seeing so few women, that's just proof that the silencing was very effective. And that makes it very difficult to trace women in the text. So it's a special event and an interesting one when a woman appears in the text. And sometimes, if you read carefully, you could find something subversive going on, or some remnants of an approach that is a little bit different than the usual patriarchal take of the Talmud. In addition to the rabbis and their family members, you will sometimes find just random lay characters. There will be some elders or beggars or children that the rabbis run into. This will often show up in the context of a story as like folk wisdom or a parable or a little story, usually to illustrate some legal principles. Not everybody who shows up in the Talmud is necessarily Jewish or Judite or Israelite. Many of these people are foreigners. There are astrologers and magicians that are mentioned in the Talmud. There are Roman noble women who, for some reason, they're called matronita, who, for some reason, really like arguing the fine points of the Talmud with rabbis. There are Roman emperors who make time off their busy schedule to argue with the rabbis. This is, of course, fake. There is no way that a Roman emperor would sit down with a Jewish rabbi shortly after the exile and have a leisurely conversation about the Mishnah. These narrative devices are usually used to bolster rabbinical authority and prestige, right? And they could also reflect some give and take with the surrounding culture. After all, the rabbis in Babylonian operated under Roman and then Sasanian governance. That means that they would have been surrounded by Christian contexts, Zoroastrian contexts, some Greco-Roman mythology, and a lot of that finds the way into the text, sometimes through these guest appearances of foreign characters. And because the text has a magical quality to it, people travel in time and place and perform all kinds of miracles and things. They also interact with mythical characters. Notably, the prophet Elijah makes a lot of cameo appearances, shows up in caves to talk to people, visits people on a regular basis to offer them some wisdom, makes appointments with them, and then either he doesn't show up or the person he's waiting for doesn't show up. So look for Elijah in the text as well. How do these people show up in the text? So sometimes it'll just be an attribution, right? Rabbi X says A, Rabbi Y says B. Sometimes a rabbi will not be directly quoted, but rather indirectly quoted. So they're going to say, Rabbi X said that Rabbi Y said. This typically happens if Rabbi Y is fairly fancy and can render some legitimacy to whatever is being said. You're going to find that not all the discourse in the Talmud is nice and civilized. Sometimes there are fights in the Bet Midrash. Sometimes people attack each other, defend each other, offend each other. We're going to find some name calling as well. Sometimes you're going to find that the rabbis appeal to higher authorities. So, for example, they will be quoting a contradictory Mishnah or a contradicting Baraita, and this Baraita might be something that we can actually trace in real life, or it can be some Baraita that they made up just to make it seem as if they know what they're talking about. You will also see layers in which later rabbis are trying to guess what the position would have been of earlier rabbis. So, for example, Rabbi Akiva, who was a Tana, is often being mentioned in the context of a discussion among the Amoraim. What do you think Rabbi Akiva thought about this? What do you think Rabbi Meir thought about this? What do you think Rabbi Elazar thought about this? Just mentioning the earlier rabbis, trying to figure out how they would consider the situation. On top of everything else, you're going to find all these little nuggets in the text that kind of come to life because they show you that these are snippets of conversations that maybe actual people were having. So somebody will say to somebody else, "Hey, I can talk to you about this law, but can you go get my sweater?" "Hey, thanks." Or somebody will enter the conversation and say, "Hey, where does this law come from?" And somebody will reply, "Oh, the day we talked about this, you were sick." So you'll find some indications that at least maybe some of these conversations could be transcripts of real things that happened in real life between real people, but we're never going to know how many. We're going to see some people go on serious ego trips, as is the case in every academic environment. Sometimes this can be lethal. Sometimes just giving somebody the stink eye can lead to their death. So there are some very tragic stories like that. But the general tenor of the Talmud is one of pluralism and respect. It is extremely common for a conversation about a particular sugya, a particular issue, to end without resolution. They're just giving you this person's opinion and this person's opinion, and they're trusting you to be the judge of what makes sense.